what is the problem in the world that Buddhists see as central, and what's their solution?
Well, the problem in Buddhism is suffering. It's very simple. It says, human beings suffer. Why do we suffer? And it presents an analysis of suffering, and it says if we understand why we suffer, the origins of suffering, then we can reverse it. And we can learn not to suffer. We can figure out ways to be in the world without suffering, which is nirvana. The blowing out literally means blowing out. It's the blowing out of suffering. And it's blowing out of the ignorance that causes suffering, and blowing out of the ego that causes suffering, and blowing out of the craving that causes suffering. So it is a kind of more psychological religion in the sense that it aims at things that we think maybe psychotherapy aims at, of being happy, of being less sad, of having less sorrow in our lives.
Yeah, it's like some people confuse Confucianism. Some people wonder if Confucianism is a philosophy or a religion, and there have been some people who've wondered if Buddhism is psychotherapy or religion, or a little bit of both.
That's right, and I think both Buddhism and Confucianism challenge our notions of what religion is. And Buddhism does that by saying you can have a religion without a God. And people who want to say, well, okay, religion's about God, then they have to say, well, Buddhism isn't a religion. And yet, if you go around Asia and see the places in East Asia or in Southeast Asia where you have Buddhists, they sure look pretty religious. And so I think what we've learned to do as scholars of religion is to say, well, we were wrong when we said that religion needs to have a god or a creator god or even supernatural beings in order to be a religion, because Buddhism doesn't necessarily have those things.
Do any Buddhists believe in God? I trust they're free to believe in God if they want to, but most don't?
Well, the classic answer is that the God proposition is not useful. The question in Buddhism isn't really what's the reality of the world. The question is how to get rid of suffering. And so if you ask a question like, is there a God? The Buddhist question in response to that question is answering that question either way going to make me less or more sad, less or more sorrowful, less or more in pain? And what the Buddha says is the God question is a question not leading to edification. In other words, it doesn't help. So don't ask it. And so I think classically Buddhists have not really been atheists. They've been agnostics in the sense of not even that they don't know whether there's a God, but they just don't care. And they think that asking that question gets you in trouble. Now that said, as the tradition develops, let me just push ahead here. As the tradition develops, the Buddhas and other heroes in the tradition start to look a lot like gods. They can do miracles. They can send you to the Pure Land, which gives you nirvana. Like they can do the most fabulous, fascinating, supernatural sorts of things. And so they really function a lot like gods in the Buddhist tradition.
Now, Buddhism does have something called the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. Do you want to say what those are?
Oh, sure, I can try. I mean, this is the story of the Buddha, where he's in this fabulous palace. He has all this money. He's got this gorgeous wife. He's got this kid.
And wait a minute. Set this in time. When is that?
Well, this is back in either the 5th or the 6th century BCE in India, in northern India, and he is he's dissatisfied. He's like, look, it's sort of the classic thing. We see this story in America too, right? The person who has everything and is unhappy still. And so he leaves and he goes wandering around and he tries to figure out the source of his suffering. And finally he sits under this tree in northern India and he realizes the roots of his own suffering and the roots of human suffering. And that's really the Four Noble Truths, which are basically, number one, humans suffer. Number two, suffering has an origin. We suffer because we're ignorant. We suffer because we desire things that we can't have. We have ignorant craving. And then that suffering can be reversed. We don't have to do it. We can go back to the origins of it and we can get rid of it. And the getting rid of it can lead us to nirvana, which is the fourth element there, which is the blowing out of suffering. So it's very much a cause and effect kind of argument here in the Four Noble Truths, that you have this problem, you want to get rid of it, you figure out where it comes from, and then you can get rid of it. And the Noble Eightfold Path is the getting rid of, right? It's saying, look, you can get rid of it through ethics. You can get rid of it through spiritual disciplines. But the key to it that has been distilled over time in the Buddhist tradition is either chanting or meditation. So you're going to, yes, lead an ethical life, but the core is going to be some kind of what we would call spiritual practice or contemplative practice that's going to get you to realize that yourself doesn't exist in the way that you wanted, that the craving never gets you what you really hope for, and if it does, it often makes you, less happy than you were before. And
those chants and or meditation help one get to, and I'm thinking here of the eight things on that eightfold path. Right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. That's
right, and that's the fourth noble truth. After there is suffering, it has an origin, it can be eliminated, and this is how it can be eliminated. That's the fourth one, and those eight that you talked about are typically divided into sort of ethics, wisdom, and spiritual practice, or as I distilled them down, and it's funny, I did this for Twitter when I was doing the world's religions in 140 characters each.
Oh my!
I said for the Eightfold Path, be kind, be wise, be mindful. Those three different arenas. Be kind is ethics, be wise, wisdom or knowledge, and then be mindful, spiritual discipline.
When you mentioned Buddhists practice meditation, and I think a lot of people in the West associate Buddhism with meditation. Is there a particular form that meditation takes in Buddhism, a particular mode, or is it fairly diverse?
Well, let me say to start that there's a lot of Buddhists actually who don't meditate. A lot of my students who come from East Asia and Southeast Asia look to monks to meditate. Especially if they come from Theravada countries, which is the oldest form of Buddhism that we see in South and Southeast Asia. There's a sense that monks are the ones who really try to get the religious goal of nirvana. What we do is try to get the proximate goal of a better rebirth, because only monks can get the real thing. So it's really more in the Mahayana Buddhism, this other form of Buddhism that we see in North Asia, that's a newer form, newer than the Theravada, the older one, where ordinary people feel that they can get the religious goal of nirvana in their lifetime, and they don't need to defer to monks to do that. And what they're going to do is a lot of different strategies. The simplest one is Vipassana meditation that's popular particularly in Southern Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, where you just are mindful of what's going on. And the most basic way of being mindful of what's going on is following your breath. Every given moment, we're breathing in, we're breathing out. And if we look more carefully, we're breathing in. There's a little space before we've stopped, or as we've stopped breathing in, but before as we've stopped breathing out, but before we're breathing in, and then there we go. And it's this sort of cycle of out in with the interstices in between. And that's Vipassana. There's also meditation that's called metta meditation that's more about compassion. And those are kind of focusing on, in a way, the two great Buddhist virtues of wisdom on the one hand, seeing the world as it really is, and then compassion, being empathetic in both feeling and action toward other human beings.
Is there such a thing as worship in Buddhist temples?
Well, again, you have to look at these two main forms of Buddhism. In the oldest form, the Theravada form from the South, I would say largely no. The argument is that the Buddha is not to be worshipped, that all we have here is human beings. We don't have gods. And so you look inside. You look to your own experience. You figure out how to get rid of your own suffering by following the Four Noble Truths. But pretty quickly in Buddhism, we developed this other form, the Mahayana form, which moves up into Japan, Korea, China. And in that form, we have Buddhas and we have these figures called bodhisattvas, who are embodiments of wisdom and compassion, and with particularly compassion. And they are worshipped. There are temples to them. You go in and you give, prasad sort of thing to them, which is what you do in a Hindu temple. Like you're going to give food to them. You're going to drape them with flowers. You're going to worship before them. Very much religious activity, because the thought is that those beings, those Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, can transfer merit to you. This is a karma world, right, where things are driven by the law of karma, where you do good comes back to you. You do bad comes back to you. You do enough of that good stuff, you have this huge storehouse of karma, and you can help other people. They sound
a bit like saints in Christianity.
Well, they are in the sense that they have sort of specialties, and you can go to them, you can pray to them, you can sidle up to them and show devotion to them. And if you do that, then they're going to help you make your way through the world and help you even, in this case, achieve nirvana.
Is there a holy book or books in Buddhism?
Well, there are many sutras. Sutras is the term, which are said to be repositories of typically the sayings of the Buddha. And Buddhists have different understandings of those. There are divisions, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, that are very much around which scripture you read. Instead of sort of it being about, as is in Hinduism, which god you worship, in Buddhism it's more, where did the Buddha really speak? Is he speaking in the Heart Sutra? Is he speaking in the Lotus Sutra? Is he speaking in the Prajnaparamita Sutra? The Perfection of Perfect Wisdom Sutra. So there are an overabundance of scriptures in the Buddhist tradition, and much of the arguments have to do the kind of philosophical art and even theological arguments have to do with which scripture do you account as closest to the real Buddha, the life of the Buddha.
Now, as to the basic beliefs of Buddhism, again, I don't think there's anything we would probably call a creed, but I know you say that at least the most ancient tradition, there's a focus on the individual or the self and basically ridding the self of suffering. But on the other hand, the self doesn't really exist. How can you explain this?
Yeah, this is one of the wonderful pieces of Buddhism. It's one of the actually hardest things for me as a teacher when I do a world religions course with my students at Boston University. How do you explain to them this idea? And I think the simplest is Buddhism is growing out of Hinduism, and Hinduism has the idea of the soul, which they call the Atman, and Buddhists reject the idea. So they say we don't have an Atman that is the same as Brahman, which is the soul of God. And Hindus want to say the soul of God is the same as the soul of the human. Brahman is Atman. Atman is Brahman. And Buddhists say, look, we don't have either of those things. We don't have souls. So we can kind of understand that because we have materialists, for example, in Western society, atheists who will say, well, we don't have souls, right? Mm-hmm. We didn't exist before we were born, and we don't exist afterwards. We have no immortal soul. So, but the tradition argues more than that. It says we don't have a self. And I think this is a more important idea. And the key thing here is that when we think of ourselves as independent beings who are non-composites, right? That we're just ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. We don't rely on someone else's mind to make us a self. We don't rely on matter or spirit or whatever. And what the Buddhist tradition says is that actually we don't have a self without all kinds of stuff. The self is a conventional designation. People look at me and point and say Steve or you, and that sort of makes me feel like I'm a self. There's all sorts of reasons why that isn't the case. There's all sorts of analogies to, say, a car or a chariot. When the chariot loses, one of its wheels is still a chariot. When it loses its axle, when it loses its seat, at a certain point, you're going to say, no, it's not a chariot anymore. Same with the human. It's a composite of various things, of spirit and matter and thoughts and perceptions and consciousness, etc. Now, this all sounds kind of crazy philosophical, but the Buddhist point to it is you don't want to suffer. And when you think you are an independent, self-existing ego apart from other human beings and apart from the ecological world around us, then you suffer. And that's the point, is egoism will drive you crazy. So don't think of yourself in this way.
But there has been that great focus on the individual in Buddhism traditionally, but today we have something called engaged Buddhism. Can you say what that is?
Well, one of the wonderful pieces of Buddhist history is that Buddhism changes so much as it moves. And, all religions change as they move through history and across the globe. But Buddhism, has inside it a sort of license to change, because one of the arguments is that it's false belief in stasis and stability and changelessness that also makes us unhappy, because everything is constantly changing. That's what you notice if you do a kind of meditation on, say, how your body feels or what your thoughts are or what your emotions are. You notice that your thoughts and emotions just constantly change. And so Buddhism, as it moves around, changes. As it goes into China, it drops the begging tradition of India, because in China, begging is just disgusting. Nobody's going to give money to a beggar. But in India, there's a great begging tradition. And so the way that the monks supported themselves was through begging, but you can't do it in China. When it comes to America, the criticism of Buddhism and of Hinduism is that they don't have a social ethic. There's the idea of karma that says you're born into this circumstance and you deserved it, because that's the sum of all your karmic activity before, all your moral activity before. So if you were born, without an arm, you deserved it. If you were born poor, you deserved it. Similarly, if you were born rich, or if you were born, whatever, tall, dark and handsome, then you deserved it. And this is just we sort of rebel against this in the West. And so Buddhists have looked to their own tradition for resources. And inside the tradition, they found this great idea of compassion, which is very much a key issue. And the so-called engaged Buddhists, people like Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, of Vietnam, have said, look, Buddhism tells us don't just sit on a cushion and meditate. That's selfish. And Buddhism isn't about selfishness. Buddhism is about compassion. It's about helping other people. If you look at these bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, what do? They help other people. That's their job. We should be more like them. And that's where this engaged Buddhism tradition comes from.
We often hear the word dharma connected with Buddhism. What does that mean?
Well, dharma is a word that comes from Hinduism, and it's interesting because in Hinduism it means duty. It really has to do, to some extent, with ethics, but also about how you should do a ritual. When it moves into Buddhism, it becomes more like teaching, in part because teaching becomes a duty, because teaching and learning become duties, because the Buddha gave these sermons where he taught the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So if you go to a Buddhist center, you might be in for a Dharma talk. And that doesn't mean a duty talk. It means a teaching about the core way of viewing the world. In Buddhism, because it isn't really theology, nor is it really philosophy, but more how the world really is, awakening to reality. I call this a way of awakening, and that's what the Dharma tries to do. It tries to show you how the world really is, as opposed to how you desire it, how you fear it might be, how you wish it would be.
And when it comes to the afterlife, if you could call it that, nirvana, the absence of suffering, Buddhists go through belief in reincarnation or rebirth, and that can happen several times, can it not, before one reaches nirvana?
That's right, and it's important to note that nirvana isn't an afterlife something. It isn't an afterlife grab. Nirvana can happen here and now, and so it isn't like, I think, because we think of heaven, we sort of think we die and we go to heaven, so we sort of think we die and we get nirvana. But nirvana is actually something that can be realized here and now. That said, the tradition does affirm reincarnation. It gets it from Hinduism because it's an Indian Hindu idea, and it adopts it. It becomes a little tricky because in Hinduism, the notion of reincarnation is that the Atman that we just talked about, the soul, recycles from life to life, so rebirth to rebirth. So we're born, we live, we die. We're born, we live, we die. What's the we? It's the Atman. It's the self. It's that, spiritual part of us. In Buddhism, they reject the Atman, and yet they have reincarnation. So what's reincarnated? And this is where Buddhists of different kinds of Buddhism are going to disagree. But one basic idea is that we have consciousness, and our consciousness is going to move from body to body. And so if you look at, say, the Vajrayana tradition, the Tibetan tradition of the Dalai Lama, the idea is that our consciousness reincarnates, so that the Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of the prior Dalai Lama, who is a reincarnation of the Dalai Lama before him. And they go around and they sort of try to find the consciousness of that person in part by like giving them the toys that as a little boy the prior Dalai Lama played with, and if they go to the right toys, then there's some evidence that may be the same person. But it is a reincarnation tradition, and that comes from Hinduism.
Mm. And Buddhism is also a missionary religion, right?
That's right. I mean, and Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world after Christianity and Islam, and then Hinduism, and in part it's because it's gone out and tried to make converts in ways that, say, Confucianism hasn't really been missionary, and neither has Judaism, for example. So there is this idea that the Buddha, after he achieved his awakening, his enlightenment, he sort of said to himself, all right, I just learned something through my own experience that can only be learned through experience. What good is it for me to go tell somebody? Because immediately it's going to get flattened out. It's going to be misunderstood. It's going to be degraded as soon as I start to talk about the experience, because the experience is beyond words. But he decides finally that – and he's tempted to just go wander off into silence. So there would have been this sort of silent Buddhism out there in this one human being. But he says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to teach it, and I know that I'll be misunderstood. But I'm going to teach it. And so he goes to Sarnath, which is in North India, outside of Varanasi or Kashi or Benares, as it's called, 3 names for that city. And he preaches, and he tries to make converts. He says, look, here's the way I understand the world to be. This is what my awakened mind sees the world as. Try it and see if it's right. Try and see if it eliminates your suffering, because it eliminated my suffering. Mm. And ever since then, Buddhists have gone out to the whole world with that message, with that Dharma message.
And Buddhism, as some other faith traditions, also has different branches. There's Mahayana Theravada, there's Tibetan Buddhism, there's Zen Buddhism. And I think it's important to say the Dalai Lama is not some kind of a Buddhist pope. He's not the leader of all these traditions, right?
That's right. He is a kind of Buddhist pope, but only for the Buddhist Roman Catholics, right? Not all of them are Tibetan Buddhists who follow the Dalai Lama, and not even all Tibetan Buddhists are in the arena of those who follow the Dalai Lama. So he has an authority inside really one of the 3 main branches, which is the Vajrayana branch, which means the diamond vehicle, sometimes called Tibetan Buddhism, that has this idea of the Lama, the Lama, who is really a kind of a guru, sort of like a Hindu guru. Then there is, yes, the Mahayana tradition, which is the northern tradition of East Asia, that has this idea of the bodhisattva that really emphasizes compassion. And then there's the older tradition, the Theravada tradition from South and Southeast Asia, that really emphasizes wisdom, that Buddhism is about wisdom. And its exemplar is the Arhat, who was really wise, whereas the exemplar in the Mahayana tradition is the bodhisattva, who was really compassionate. And then the exemplar in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is the Lama, who is said to combine the virtues of both of those, to sort of synthesize elegantly Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism by being about both wisdom and compassion.
Mm. And I know here in Washington there is a group called, that are Soka Gakkai Buddhists.
Yes, Soka Gakkai is a form of Japanese Buddhism that is a chanting tradition, and it becomes popular. It's a modern tradition. It's recent, and it becomes popular in the United States, particularly after World War II. And one of the really interesting things about the SGI, the Soka Gakkai International, is that it's really multiracial. Buddhism in the United States and in the West tends to be pretty white, but in part because of its emerging out of after World War II and in the Vietnam War era too, where there were a lot of war brides who married African Americans and who married Hispanic Americans. And there's a really strong tradition in SGI of trying to work across racial and ethnic boundaries. Mm-hmm. So it's actually one of the most integrated forms of religion in America is the SGI. And it's a chanting religion, by the way. It's not about silent meditation. It's about chanting in a group.
And finally, why is Buddhism becoming increasingly popular in North America? And in your book, you also say Australia and New Zealand.
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, I think Buddhism in general is on the run in terms of the last century. It's really suffered a lot at the hands of, say, China's move towards secularism. But in the West, it has had a kind of vogue, and it's interesting because I think that Americans have dealt with Asian religions in a kind of a sort of a back and forth way, where we were into Hinduism for a while with the Beatles, and then we got into Buddhism with the Beats, maybe even before the Beatles, and then we got into Buddhism again in the 1990s, and we're back into yoga, which is more Hindu now. So there's a sort of a back and forth thing, but I think the thing that attracts us about Buddhism is it gives us spirituality without God. And the way to say it maybe more broadly is it gives us spirituality without religion. I mean, now Buddhism is a religion, but the way that Americans appropriate it in the West is more in terms of its contemplative practices. So we kind of get this amazing tradition that has thought for 2,500 years about what techniques can we use to eliminate suffering, what techniques can we use for individual spiritual contemplation. And we're able to borrow those without this sort of sense of God, revelation, prophets, required rituals, things like that. And that seems really freeing to a lot of Americans. And I think that's part of the source of its popularity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. Stephen Prothero is a professor of religion at Boston University and the author of God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. And you can read more about all these religions in that book. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot.